All right, I think we can get started. Thank you everyone for being here and welcome. My name is Simonetta Moro and I am the director of the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, the first low residency PhD program in art and philosophy based in Portland, Maine in the United States, and founded by Dr. George Smith, who is here with us today. So welcome, George. And a big welcome to Nephi Craig, who is giving this talk today, Landscape is Destiny, and whom I will briefly introduce. But let me go over a few technical details first. This webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, including the Q&A. So we'll take questions from the audience following the presentation. Please write your questions in the dedicated Q&A box, which you see at the bottom of your screen, I believe, so that we may read them out loud after the presentation. Please don't use the chat box for your questions. We ask you to use the Q&A so that you can see your questions more easily. And feel free to put your name if you wish. This webinar will be recorded and shared on our Vimeo channel afterward. And now to our illustrious guest. Chef Nephi Craig is the founder of the Native American Culinary Association, a network of native cooks, chefs, scholars, farmers, and community members devoted to the development and preservation of Native American foodways. Chef Craig has 24 years culinary experience in America and around the world, in London, Germany, Brazil, and Japan. He is an enrolled member of the White Mountain Apache Tribe, and he is half Navajo. Chef Nephi Craig provides training, workshops, and lecture sessions on Native American cuisine for health to schools, restaurants, university, treatment centers, behavioral health agencies, and tribal entities from across America and abroad. He served as executive chef of the Sunrise Park Resort Hotel, and during his 9-year tenure at the Sunrise Park Resort, Craig and his White Mountain Apache culinary team achieved many national and international benchmarks in establishing a culture of indigenous foods across North America. Chef Craig was also featured in the film Gather from 2020, which is a documentary on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, and is also a pioneer in the development of restorative indigenous food practices, a term which is critical for social recovery and indigenous resurgence during this age of fast food and disease. Restorative indigenous food practices is a place-based social science technique that integrates developments from a variety of disciplines and fields, including nutrition, education, psychology, social work, criminology, sociology, organizational development, industrial psychology, indigenous leadership, and recovery principles in order to build healthy communities, decrease crime and antisocial behavior, and restore relationships. Chef Craig is an advanced certified relapse prevention specialist and behavioral health technician, currently serving as the Nutritional Recovery Program Coordinator at the Rainbow Treatment Center and Executive Chef of Café Gozhóó on the White Mountain Apache Tribe in Arizona. He is also a published author. He has written pieces for the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and the Center for American Indian Elderly. Craig is a contributing author for the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture's first book titled Letters to a Young Farmer, published in March 2017. Chef Craig also writes about the state of Native American culinary traditions affected by hunting, fishing, and agricultural rights, as well as United States and Indian relations in Native American history. And finally, I'm proud to announce that in recognition of all his accomplishments, Chef Craig will receive an honorary doctorate from IDSPA during our annual commencement in Mexico City in January 2023. And now it is my pleasure to leave the stage to Chef Nephi Craig. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. Everybody that's joining us, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and your lives to come and share some time with me as I present here today. I'm coming to you from the White Mountain Apache Tribe in northeastern Arizona. This is in our ancestral landscape. We are about 3.5 hours northeast of Phoenix. We are in the high mountains, so we have all 4 seasons. And my presentation today and my talk has a number of different elements to it. There's a lot of misconceptions that we face as Native peoples in all fronts of our lives, whether it's cultural, economic, culinary, socially. There's so many misconceptions that are placed on Native peoples in the United States and across the Americas. And throughout my lifetime as a chef, starting out as a young cook on a journey to understand cooking and cuisine, food has been my most profound teacher. And entering a life of recovery, I've been able to understand and learn a great deal. So as I begin to present, kind of look at my presentation like a breathing heart, right? It expands. It goes into the past and it goes into the future, but we're always kind of staying focused on solution-based practices in here and now today. We will talk about historical themes of, say, historical trauma, colonial violence. We will talk about health disparities as we understand them or misunderstand them. As mentioned in my bio, I'm a clinician. I do therapeutic behavioral health groups. My approach to that is with a combination of foodways, hands-on application, skill building, and the adding in the indigenous food history to help revitalize individuals, enhance the self-perception so that they can reach for and realize their potential. In a kitchen, at home, in life in general, we hope that these food practices can just enhance people's lives. So my journey is 24 years. I started off in White River, Arizona, not knowing how far cooking would take me. My mother is White Mountain Apache, and my father, my late father, is Navajo. So I'm White Mountain Apache and Navajo, and I spent time on both reservations growing up. Since my mother is White Mountain Apache and we are matrilineal societies, I identify as White Mountain Apache first. And that's something that my father always supported and always reminded us of as young men growing up, as little boys into young men, into the fathers and parents we are today. That because we're matrilineal societies, we identify as White Mountain Apache. And so I would be able to spend the first half of my life, well, from, the first 10 years of my life on the White Mountain Apache Tribe, and the next 8 or 9 years on the Navajo Nation. Both landscapes very I cherish them very much. And so I grew up not knowing that I was getting a culinary education in a sense, something that's, supplemental. When I got to culinary school when I was 18 years old, I entered not knowing what I was getting into. I had no previous restaurant experience. I didn't really even know anything about restaurant culture as a practice. So getting into Foodway, into general hospitality in a culinary school in 1998, it was entering the unknown, really. And it was a culture shock because the paradigm or the perspectives that were being taught around classical cuisine were very different from how I had experienced it as a kid. And I knew, well, I didn't really have the words to articulate that I had a supplemental education in Foodways. But the reason I say that, because I came into cooking school as a Native person, growing up seeing food a part of ceremony. I grew up seeing food a part of life and death ceremonies, celebration. At every different benchmark throughout our lives, food is always there and celebrated. Our clan system is informed by landscapes and foodways. Almost all of our arts and crafts across Native America are food vessels. Our textiles, our clothing, our philosophies, our ideals are all interconnected with foodways. And so I kind of had a general sense of this as an 18-year-old kid, right? Because you grow up seeing it, and then you get into a culinary school and you see just general restaurant culture, learning about the cuisines of classical cuisines of like France and Italy and Asia. In the culinary school I was at, I began to see that food was something that separated people in the way they were teaching it to us in that school. Whereas I had grown up seeing food as something that was sacred and special that brought us together. So that early interaction with the industry, food industry, kind of began to realize that we were left out of this world history of cuisine. There was no mention of indigenous peoples' contributions to the world. Maybe we did cover and talk about ingredients like chocolate or chilies, tomatoes, but there were no in-depth articulation about how sophisticated indigenous cultures were before 1500, and how this food technology, this agricultural science, the mathematics, engineering, and emotional intelligence work had really helped to change and revolutionize world cuisine forever. So I'm really kind of giving a really broad overview of how that early experience shifted my perception. I always think that these experiences would be planted as seeds and they would continue to expand and grow. And so throughout time, in my indigenous experience, living in the United States and growing up, as you heard from my bio, I've been able to do a lot of international work and travel in my younger life, which I was very fortunate to do. So I kind of see myself as having like a dual perspective. I've got this this one perspective that's definitely or kind of like a Western paradigm, so to speak. And I have this international perspective, but I also have my indigenous side, my White Mountain Apache, Navajo, Native side. So it's like I can see myself outside of myself sometimes. I can see my culture and my community outside of myself sometimes, almost from an outsider's perspective. And this dual consciousness or dual perspective kind of activates a lot of humorous components to how we are as natives. And so my journey, it's kind of been informed by wanting to understand themes of health. My journey to become a chef, I was really just wanted to do something with fine dining in the beginning. But as I began to follow the foods and encounter things in life like we all do, such as loss and trauma, heartbreak and failure, and all of these things that make life beautiful, I would begin to unravel new lessons, or the foods would help to unravel new lessons for me and shape my philosophy and shape my orientation to colonization. So my experience, I like to say I try to keep it as real as I can. I tell people that this is very serious work, but don't take it too serious. You know, I like to share with people to season their cooking with humor and laughter, and to really engage in storytelling, to take time out of our lives to slow down, put down our phones, turn off the TV, and cook together as a family. Because as we get into this presentation, I hope to share information that will maybe shift your paradigm, maybe challenge some notions of what you believe is fact in America. But ultimately, when we push aside, what I think is beautiful about Foodways and these practices is that we could get very deep into the political, legal discussions around foodways and the politics of food. And there's so much jargon, so much language, so many opinions, and so much skewed history, that when we just turn on the stove, or we tend a garden, or we cook and eat with our families, we kind of push all of that information to the side, and we're just left with the experience of relationship building or relationship mending. And that's where the real healing is. That's where neurogenesis occurs. That's where neuroplasticity is supported. That's where we build trust, love, and interaction as a group, as individuals. So foodways have been very powerful. And my perspective, like I was saying, is shaped by a lot of different things. I grew up in the 90s as a teenager, so my mind is informed by classical punk rock music. Like my paradigm is also heavily influenced by street hip hop of the golden era of the 1990s. The music that I heard then appealed to me in a way that I understand now, is that as a minority in America, now as a 42-year-old practitioner, I understand themes of colonial violence and justice and injustices in America. And looking back, I realized that as an Indigenous person, the injustices and the angst and the oppression that was woven into the fabric of golden era hip hop was speaking to me, because I was experiencing the same things. See, I didn't know this as a young teenager and a young adult, but as I got deeper into the practice of following the foods and allowing the food to speak, I began to hear these themes. So my paradigm is still very much influenced by, punk rock, hip hop. I grew up as a skateboarder, and those themes of my life really enabled me to never give up. My story, my journey involves addiction, alcoholism, and recovery. And so the combination, the angst of punk rock and the angst of hip hop and the poetry of that, and the tenacity and character building of skateboarding to continuously try a trick until you get it, has really helped to shape my perspective in the work that I do, and especially in getting clean and sober. So as we begin to enter into this presentation I'm going to share, I wanted to share a couple terms to help situate my perspective. And if you want, you can write them down. In this Indigenous experience, in this generation, we are very fortunate to be able to expand paradigms and challenge narratives. I feel very grateful to be a part of this movement forward, this cultural phenomenon that's happening, because so many of what we are taught about ourselves as Native peoples is not written by us. So over the past, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, more and more Indigenous professionals have become credentialed professionals in all different areas. And there's more researchers, there's more Native public health officials, there's more X, Y, and Z, more chefs, more literary agents, more writers, doctors, scientists, you name it. We are entering more and more of these professions, and we are challenging narratives. And so in this, we do create new terms and terminology for ourselves to articulate this experience. And so just a few that I like to share that I use frequently. The first one is indigeneity. You can see it right there. See that in my list of principles. Indigeneity is basically the right or the freedom to live out your indigenousness, the right or the freedom to live out your Apache-ness, right? Your Navajo-ness, because that is the core part of who you are, to live out your identity as a Native person. Sometimes in some circles, it's dangerous to be Native. Sometimes in some circles, it's oppressive to be Indigenous and to express your beliefs. So when we are able to live out our indigeneity, we're more safe, and therefore we have the ability to learn more and heal and recover and a lot of other things. So indigeneity is a really important term for me. And so basically it's just living it out. Another term I use frequently is colonization. You're probably familiar with it. And from the way that I use it is definitely in the academic sense, in the social sense, in the rebellious sense, and from the perspective as an Indigenous person. Colonization is a violent act of overtaking landscapes, supporting and being an accomplice or a perpetrator of ethnogenocide of people, land, and waters. It's a political act, it's a violent act, and it has long-term impacts on cultures. Colonization is just like one of the first elements of, it's like a domino effect, right? Understanding the process of colonization of the Americas, you begin to unravel Indigenous history. And then the next term that I use frequently is colonial violence. And colonial violence, I say, is like a shapeshifter. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. It comes in the form of microaggressions. It comes in the form of awards, resources, support. It comes in so many different forms. Colonial violence is very transactional. It's a phenomenon that's, if you're not able to identify it, it's still going to impact you as a Native person, but you're not going to be able to pinpoint it. So understanding colonial violence is one of those really important things. In this presentation, the topic landscape is destiny. Right now in our generation, there's a movement where young Native peoples have started hashtagging land back. And land back is not a metaphor. It's a literal thing. Like, we want land back in a lot of different ways, and it's happening slowly. And so when we don't have access to land, we have the inability to truly heal and reconnect. And that's a form of colonial violence. Decolonization, definitely use it in the academic sense, in the rebel sense, the indigenous sense, and the radical sense. Very well aware that decolonization often, to overthrow power structures, often comes with intense aggression, violence, and loss. And so decolonization has kind of evolved as a term in Indian country that has been applied to a lot of different practices. And in the sense that I use it frequently, interchangeably, is to really kind of help us understand. I look at it kind of like a metaphor, that decolonization is the threshold term. Decolonization is just the beginning, because on the other side of that doorway is the lifetime journey of living it out. So a lot of times as a cultural phenomenon, young people, academics, professionals, people in general gravitate towards the realm of decolonization because of its romantic mystique that comes with it, of rebel culture. But I always tell people, when they come upon decolonization for the first time and they're excited about it, they want to put their fist in the air, be a frontliner and join this resistance. I encourage them to be tactful about that, because if you're not fully understanding the reasons behind decolonization and what you want to do, you can kind of end up being a perpetrator or an accomplice to colonial violence as a shapeshifter within decoloniality, if that makes sense. So decolonization, to me, when I look at it, it's just like recovery from trauma, from loss, from addiction, whatever it might be, because we're essentially detaching from something that really hurt us and wounded us spiritually. So that's kind of that in a nutshell. There's much more to it, but I'll move on to the next term I like to use frequently. And the next term is ancestral knowledge. And to me, ancestral knowledge is a place-based thing. Ancestral knowledge in the White Mountains of Arizona will be very different from ancestral knowledge in the Great Plains. It's informed by landscape. It's informed by ecologies. It's informed by generations of storytelling. So ancestral knowledge is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives, and it is a very, very powerful tool. It is so powerful that it doesn't seem like it is at all. So the next term you'll hear me say and use is Indigenous Resurgence. And Indigenous Resurgence is a term used by academics and professionals and people on the ground across Native communities. In the way I hear it and the way I use it is that our cultures are on this in this journey to resurge against this colonizing force, right? The legacy of colonial violence that we've inherited, we're on a resurgent path forward. And the Indigenous resurgence is happening in all fronts, at the community level, in the spiritual level, in the academic level, in the professional level. And in the homes, resurgence is, if colonial violence is like a shapeshifter, so is Indigenous resurgence, because to mend the fractured connections in our DNA, right? We've got to be able to hit all areas of our lives as we participate in Indigenous resurgence. So one way to support people in this work and not perpetuate colonial violence is to allow Indigenous people's narratives to be expressed, is to enhance and support Indigenous perspectives and paradigms and narratives, so that you're not perpetuating colonial violence and oppressing more. You'll hear us say Indigenous Foodways. Indigenous Foodways is basically anything that relates to food. In a lot of food work, there's a term used called gastronomy, right? And that's anything related to food and cooking. It's very similar to that, but Indigenous Foodways is, as you can see, is specific. So it's the weaving, it's the farming, it's the storytelling, it's the songs, it's the planting songs, the ceremonies. Indigenous Foodways is the consumption of food and the timing of eating. Indigenous Foodways is anything related to food and food practices. And then the final one, before I start this presentation, is Indigenous Food Sovereignty. Indigenous Food Sovereignty is a growing and expanding term. It means different things to different people and practitioners. But what Indigenous Food Sovereignty means to me is having the right, the resources, and the ability to utilize food, ancestral knowledge, Indigenous foodways, and Indigenous research practices, Indigenous resurgence practices as curriculum in your everyday life, as a treatment modality, as a prescription, as your community's own form of education for kindergarten curriculum, right? For elementary school kids. Being able to integrate food as a part of your educational practice, teaching and learning modalities freely, and not to be oppressed by the food police, right? By people who might want to shut you down because it doesn't qualify as academic and scientific. So Indigenous food sovereignty could be cooking, it could be restaurants, it could be writing and reading, it could be the arts and crafts associated, the spiritual cultural practices. Indigenous food sovereignty is vast and it's place-based. It's not universal all the way across, but the principles of it are very much universal. So before I jump into the presentation, it'll be about maybe 20, 30 minutes, and I use photo voice. I allow the pictures to speak a little bit more, and I kind of discuss what's going on a little bit there. Just to give you a little background on me as a White Mountain Apache, there are many different Apache groups. I'm a part of the White Mountain Apache Tribe in northeastern Arizona. Our region in Arizona is categorized as Western Apacheria, or we are Western Apaches. The Western Apache group consists of the Yavapai Apaches, the Tonto Apaches, the San Carlos Apaches, and the White Mountain Apaches. On the eastern band and group of Apaches, Chiricahuas, Jicarillas, Mescaleros, right? And a number of other groups that even go down into Mexico. And so it's important to understand that not all these Apache groups are the same, and we've all got different experiences with colonization and Indigenous resurgence. So I just wanted to put that, kind of make that distinction before I go into the presentation. So I will go ahead and start now. Let me do my screen share. Okay. Hang on just a second. Yeah, I chose the wrong one there. Yeah, okay. Okay. So I'm gonna, we'll go ahead and get started. So kind of sharing that information and talking about Indigenous foodways and my perspective as a practitioner. See, I started out as a chef wanting to understand cooking and cuisine, and I didn't fully understand that I started out as a chef trying to understand the oppressor's way of cooking, right? I didn't know that I was gravitating towards classical cuisine, classical French cuisine, in a sense, in a way, because I had, you know, the growing up in a colonized reality, I was kind of programmed or taught to gravitate towards sophistication and things like that. So this perspective is, a lot of times what I share has been the culmination of trying to understand why there are no native restaurants in America, trying to understand why there's no food history taught about us in curriculum and institutions and whatnot. And it ends up by following and investigating the food and landscape, you begin to understand that it also applies to other professions as well. So food as an investigative tool has been very powerful. And so the title Landscape is Destiny, almost all native tribes consider themselves a reflection of their landscape, us included. So here in Western Apache, it's common knowledge and it's pretty well known that different parts of our landscapes are our relatives. Foods and plants that grow in a certain region are our cousins, according to our clan system. Our language, our ceremonies, our farming techniques, they're all connected to foodways, and they all inform our identity today and in history. So when we have access to land, we can activate our indigeneity, we can behaviorally activate indigenousness, and we can live out our destiny in a way that's a life of recovery, a life of decolonization, and life of construction, right? So landscape is destiny is a phrase that I came up with because it's been what I've come to in my own life of recovery, and Indigenous Resurgence through Foodways is kind of the mirror and the lens that I try to share my perspective with. So we will start here. So the first doorway in is this generic and term of historical trauma. Defining and understanding it. This is the beginning of the journey because we have to understand that historical trauma is real. In therapy culture, as a practice to treat and work with mental health disorders, recovery, emotional behavioral health, a lot of times you'll hear it used as historical trauma theory. And as a Native person, that is insulting in a sense, because historical trauma is real. Here's evidence that historical trauma is real, is that I am unable to communicate this angst, confusion, loss, and heartbreak, and the optimism and hope for recovery. I'm unable to communicate that to you all in my Apache language. I'm unable to communicate and articulate my experience in the Navajo language. I'm speaking to you and communicating in the oppressor's language, the English language. So that's one way to say that historical trauma is real, and from my perspective. So the historical trauma is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan across generations emanating from massive group trauma experiences. The collective emotional and psychological injury, both over a lifespan and generations, resulting from cataclysmic history of genocide. The effects of historical trauma include unsettling trauma, depression, high mortality, increase of alcohol abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence. Subjective experience and remembering of war-related events in the mind of an individual or in the life of a community. And so this is the term that was put together and featured, as you can see in the credit there, from American's Journal of Psychotherapy. This is, like it says, a generational wounding, psychological, spiritual, right? This is kind of like the term decolonization, in my opinion. It's the beginning. It's where we take a stark look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how have we been complacent? How have we been accomplices? And how have we perpetuated the continuation of historical trauma through colonial violence, right? As I mentioned, colonization and colonial violence are shapeshifters, and these impacts have not gone away for us. So as we're going to talk about health disparities across Native America, the perception that Native Americans can't get their act together, that the reservation is full of poverty and, you know, suicidality is high, alcoholism and addiction is high, all of these social ills that are seen from an outsider's perspective are rarely ever traced in an authentic and truthful way to the root cause of historical trauma. and intergenerational grief. So food as a practice is very intimate and very emotional. And when we are able to combine that with the component of access to land, we can really unravel and begin to heal from historical trauma. And so there are historical trauma deniers out there. There are Native peoples that will dispute it and say, no, it's not that bad. It's okay. I've got a house. I've got a car. There's the misconception that, you know, historical trauma or decolonization is about going back to living in an old school wiki up, you know, out, you know, minus modern conveniences. That is not the case. That's a very uninformed perspective of historical trauma and decolonization. So as you can see here, the third part of it says the effects of historical trauma include mortality, of alcohol abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence. These are very deep-rooted things that are intergenerational. So that's the first doorway term, and it's really important that we do not stay stuck here, that we do not stay stuck in this realm of trauma and grief. We're keenly aware of it, and it's our responsibility to meet each other where we're at. Because in the trauma work, it's important to remember that not everybody is ready to unravel or relive or learn the history. But those of us that do have the choice to spot it out and be able to identify how it's still playing out around us. And so I say when we present this slide is that we understand the history of historical trauma, but then we develop and make a conscious decision to become solution-based in our thinking, our action, and our behaviors. So that's the first term. In understanding food history and, you know, like I said, like why are there no Native American restaurants and all this, how has it impacted my life as a chef? How is it going to impact my life in my future? Is there a future for me as a Native chef? I had to break it down and try to unravel and understand food history for us. And I had to break it into, for me, I broke it into 3 different areas. And the first one is pre-contact, right? Prior to 1500, indigenous cultures had been intact and thriving for thousands of years. People in the Americas were expert fishers, hunters, and farmers. And this is from Argentina through South America to Mexico, the United States, Canada, and Alaska. We know that the domestication of indigenous American foods is one of the most important parts of how civilization thrived. This relationship of landscape and agriculture combined with identity and philosophy and ceremony really helps to strengthen indigenous cultures pre-contact, right? So the domestication of indigenous foods is one of the areas, and we'll just talk about 3 different important ones. The list is in the thousands of indigenous foods of the Americas, and we'll focus on 3 here. The first one being corn. I chose to talk about this first one because as a White Mountain Apache and a Navajo, I'm a corn person. We're corn people, and corn is one of those ingredients that only became what it is in the hundreds of strains because of human interaction and selective seed saving. So ancestral bioengineering of cultivars and ancestral trade routes and ceremonies and songs allow corn to become what it is in the many, many different varieties. So corn, that's why corn is considered sacred in so many cultures and civilizations, is because without that human relationship, it would not be what it is today. And this human relationship is thousands and thousands of years old. So that's one of the first cultivars that is pretty common knowledge. But then the next cultivar is beans. So these are tepary beans from the Tohono tribe. And I chose to show this particular image because tepary beans from the Tohono tribe are very, very drought resistant. They're very high in protein. They're great for diabetics because they help regulate blood sugars. And what's neat about this is that when people in the Sonoran Desert began to grow and revitalized the practice of growing tepary beans, they began to realize collectively that it was intergenerational. They needed the youth to tend the fields, and the children would be able to play in the fields, and it needed the elders, the support of the elders that knew some of the history, that knew the planting songs. It required the singers to activate and be able to use this. So when we bring back foods, that's not the only thing that we're bringing back. We're bringing back all of the things that intersect around food and cooking. So these are tepary beans, the second indigenous cultivar that I'm sharing here today. And remember, there were no beans in Europe before 1500. There's like the chickpea, there's the lentil, right? There's the garbanzo, but all other beans that are named in all the different Western languages are indigenous to the Americas. The next one is squash. So corn, beans, and squash are the three cultivars that have been a really profound teacher in my life. And here is yellow patty pans and summer zucchini squash. But every single squash has its own story and identity. Squash begins as a gourd, and again, over thousands of years of selective planting, it becomes edible. In the beginning, it's very bitter, and through seed saving and agricultural practice, it becomes edible, and there's all these different varieties. So these three ingredients are one of my favorite entryway foods, because they're also known and considered and talked about as being called the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. And I feel like this is tangible, real-time evidence of ancestral intelligence, of ancestral knowledge, and that our diets were mostly plant-based, supplemented by game. And so because, as we'll see here, the Three Sisters is one of the ways we can discover how sophisticated, our food cultures are and have been. So different people from parts of North America used a wide range of agricultural techniques, best known as interplanting of corn, beans, and squash, often referred to as the Three Sisters. You'll hear that also being called companion planting. So in a Three Sisters planting, the three cultivars benefit from one another. Corn provides support for beans. Beans, like other legumes, have bacteria living on their roots that help them absorb nitrogen from the air. Corn, which also requires a lot of nitrogen, benefits the most. The large squash leaves shade the soil, prevent weed growth, deter little animal pests. So these three cultivars together, when they're grown in a companion planting, they're really demonstrating symbiotic relationships. They're helping each other out from seed all the way until we consume them. They're there for us. So it's hardly surprising that these are considered to be special gifts from Creator, because the Three Sisters' central role as sustainers of life, a wide range of stories, customs, celebrations, and ceremonies are associated with them. Corn also lacks two essential amino acids that are essential to create a protein. Beans and squash provide these two amino acids and complete the building blocks of protein, making the Three Sisters a complete nutritional food source. So to me, that's a very special and neat example of how indigenous science, indigenous nutrition, storytelling, and foodways combine as an example. To me, this is a really neat and powerful tool, because you can teach this simple fact of indigenous history to kindergartners by growing a Three Sisters garden. You can teach it to elementary school and middle school and high school kids by letting them tend the Three Sisters garden. You can teach the history of the cultivars. You can do it as an academic college level research project on Three Sisters. You could even do some doctorate work in nutrition and indigenousness about Three Sisters planting. So at all levels, this is a really neat example of how the Three Sisters has been a learning tool for me. And I really love to share that story. So the next phases as we move through this, the second part is contact, right? The pre-contact era, we kind of honed in and focused on three cultivars, corn, beans, and squash, but there are many, many, many more. moving into the next era of understanding of how food and health disparities have impacted us. We have to talk about contact, 1500, and this clash of cultures, right? And I use this slide here, this picture of the Coronado expedition, because this is in my region of the country. In 1540 to 42 approximately, they come up from Mexico and they're making their way into Apache land. See, this right here is Western Apacheria, where I'm putting the cursor, from up into the mountains near Flagstaff, along the Mogollon Rim, down near Phoenix, down near Tucson, and up towards New Mexico. That's all Western Apache territory. And Coronado, the route they took, they came right through this area. And I always say they came across the Apaches and, oh, they got scared and took off this way, but who knows? But this history that we're taught, we're rarely included in the narrative of how this has impacted our foodways, how it impacted our lives forever. One theme of this era of contact is manifest destiny in the Indian Wars. Manifest destiny was a very important turning point that allowed the continuation of ethnogenocide of people, land, and waters. This era of change really kind of revolutionized our lives, and it's really sensationalized across United States history and among our own histories. And we leave out the fact that a tactic of war is attacking food supplies and infrastructure and ancestral knowledge, food technology. All of this is a part of our indigenous infrastructure as well. And this all kind of comes to a halt during this violent era of like 500 years, right? So there's a painting I share from 1872 by John Gass called American Progress. This is an allegorical representation of the modernization of the New West. Here, Columbia, a personification of the United States, leads civilization westward with American settlers. Stringing telegraph wires, she sweeps west. She holds a school book. The different stages of economic activity of the pioneers are highlighted, and especially the changing forms of transportation. And when I zoom out and you see this picture, take a look at the left side, Native Americans and animals flee in terror. So this image here, when I saw it as a younger person, and in the journey to understand food and health, I began to see this from a different perspective. Remember that dual consciousness I spoke about? I can see this from a religious perspective that I kind of, because I grew up in organized religion, right? I can see this from that perspective, that this looks like they're doing a service. But from the indigenous side and the indigenous perspective, this is a wartime propaganda image, because this sets the stage and allows colonial violence to become socially acceptable, to become supported by government funds and state policy and legals, the legalities of land theft, right? The term terra nullius comes into play, where the landscape is dead. And so you can see this is from our perspective as a Native person, and mine included, this is a wartime propaganda image. And you can see it shows that she's bringing the light, all is good, industrious, X, Y, and Z, and we're running in terror in the darkness, right? So this is a very powerful image that is being challenged, and it's a part of the master narrative from an indigenous perspective, and it impacts our foodways. Remember, everything that we're talking about here is about landscape, foodways, and health. So as a result of manifest destinies and the wars in America, culinary traditions, ceremonies associated with hunting, gathering, and consuming food were interrupted all over America. This ensuing conflict or clash of cultures would introduce new technologies, weapons, foods, and the concept of land ownership. This is an era of great change because of guns, germs, and steel. And so this is a lasting element. And a lot of times we only focus on the political, the economic, the social, and we rarely focus on the culinary or the foodway impacts. And so as we move forward out of kind of towards the end of the 1800s, as the Indian Wars came to an end with various bands of Apaches, the United States government created reservations in an attempt to civilize and contain the Indian. This containment of Native American peoples limited the hunting, gathering, fishing, and other methods of procuring foods. And this is a photo here, a famous photograph of General Crook right here in negotiation with Geronimo here and his other band of Apaches throughout here, sitting in the back. And all reservations in the United States started out as prison camps. It's important to remember that. It wasn't a happy time where he said, all right, you can go have this little plot of land. No. Towards the end of the majority of the Indian wars and conflicts, we entered the reservation era, and we are still in this era today. And so it's important to remember that no matter where you are in the United States, you're standing on Indian land, on indigenous territory. And this is why landscape is destiny is so important. The colonization process begins on the East Coast, and it really rapidly moves west. We think of benchmarks like the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark expedition, us getting the United States getting land from Mexico, and then as it impacts us in Arizona, the gold rush, right, of the 1848, 49 into that era, because as the land grabs were happening and things were going on and discovered gold in California, they rush and pass through our areas. Some stay and settle and find copper mines near Globe, Arizona and whatnot. But in a lot of sense, in a lot of ways, you can imagine the decimation of millions of peoples in the Americas for the theft of land, for that manifest destiny concept, for a lot of these other ideals that came with the Western construct. And so every single one of these reservations that are here on this map, these are all the contemporary reservations in the United States. Almost every single one of these has a military fort established there nearby. So Fort Laramie, Fort Lauderdale, Fort Defiance, Fort Apache, Fort Sill, every single one of these are all military outposts to control and to contain us through military forms, through military means, but using the use of deadly force. So each one of these are prison camps in the beginning, and they, in a sense, they still very much are. So this reservation era changes our lives forever. This is a photograph of military food rations at Pine Ridge in approximately 1891. We go from being, within a couple generations, go from being autonomous strategic agriculturalists, hunter-gatherers, farmers, fishers, whatever our landscape allowed us to be, we go from being that to becoming taught dependency. I say that dependency was created and programmed like a microchip and installed into our culture. Dependency is not an indigenous trait. It's not a human trait. So this is one way through the foods that we were taught to become dependent on foods that are not native. And they're standing in line for military food rations here in this photograph. This dramatic change in native psychology and culinary traditions impacts us forever. The new reservation boundaries limit agriculture, foraging, hunting, and fishing. The military outlawed many cultural practices, including ceremony. Jumping the reservation was often punishable by hanging. Family patriarchs are stripped of their roles as hunters, providers, etc., and made reliant on food rations. Indigenous parent traditions are lost or interrupted. Many people turn to alcohol as a method of coping with a new way of life or to mourn the old ways. So this is a very, very violent era. And after this, the dust is beginning to settle, right? And this widespread cultural depression sets in. Remember, we're not just on reservations as a happy gift of land. No, we're on reservations as a prison camp. We are actual prisoners of war. For example, my census number as a Native American person, it's kept in a different part of the government system than yours is. Mine is kept in the Department of the Interior in the War Department. Yours is not. And that is true for all Native American census numbers as well. So this post-Indian War, this cultural depression sets in across Native America, and it takes different forms. It brings us to another era of warfare, that it wasn't enough to wipe out, contain, create prison camps. The next onslaught was to attack the children of prisoners of war. So here, this is Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt, founder and superintendent of the Carlisle School in 1879. The Carlisle School was the school that set the template for every boarding school in the United States and into Canada. Every boarding school would follow this theme, and his sentiment was "Kill the Indian, save the man." And this Carlisle School here in 1885, the theme there, "Kill the Indian, save the man." This brings us into another branch of our culinary history with the boarding school era. If you look at this picture from Carlisle School, there's hundreds of Native kids here from different tribes across the United States. And if you look carefully and closely, not one of them are smiling. This is an era of change that happens by force to the young minds of Indigenous children. And so as we look at these black and white pictures, I always encourage people to remember that these pictures are not far away. My grandfather, Joseph Carley Ivins, was at this school. My grandfather, Joseph Carley Ivins, was taken from Sibique here on the White Mountain Apache Res, put on a train in Holbrook, Arizona, sent across the coast to Pennsylvania to be at this school. And I think we're desensitized when we look at black and white imagery. We think it's so long gone and long ago. No, it's not. And that's how historical trauma is real. And that's why this plight or this journey towards indigeneity and recovery are so very important. So food traditions are changed dramatically by force. Boarding school students are introduced to new foods, table manners, and a non-native perception of food. Here's the Phoenix Indian School in the early 1900s. You can see the individual place settings, right? Whereas before, we're sharing and gathering around a fire and eating together and celebrating food in a very different way. So this is really reprogramming of our paradigms of ourselves around food. This is the Tulalip Indian School up in Tulalip, Washington. They're supposedly learning a trade, right? Civilizing natives. They look happy and they're all there, but check out this this teacher here. She looks brutal, right? It always makes me laugh when I get to this picture, because she kind of outs the whole propaganda image here, because that's exactly what this is. The boarding school experience was a very traumatic and violent one. These black and white images of boarding schools, these are propaganda images. The wartime was not the violent military war, but it was psychological war against children and young adults. So these are propaganda images staged to make it look like life was all good and happy in the boarding schools, when in reality it was very adverse, violent. Malnourishment was common, abuse, sexual abuse, and deaths were very, very high. We say now in our generation, and it's been common before, that boarding schools in America are the only schools for children with graveyards. And up in Canada and in our generation today, we're unearthing hundreds of thousands of children's remains from boarding schools, and it's going to continue. So again, this is the Phoenix Indian School in the 1900s. More of these propaganda images. However, food is so powerful that these powerful sensory food experiences remain with children in boarding school. They write home and talk of disliking new food and culture. They write home and home and talk about what they miss about their favorite native foods. And was able to learn and understand some of this because years ago, I reached out to the Carlisle School and asked the archives if I could have access to any food related information at the school. And I had to pay a fee, and they sent back a packet of a lot of food related information. And some of those were photocopies of letters home, drawings, menus, but it really kind of gave a sad but useful and powerful insight into how food traditions were impacted in these kind of institutions. Moving forward into this era, we kind of, the reservation, the prison camps become politically, you know, they have to become socially acceptable. And so does the military food ration program. It morphs into something called the commodity foods, becomes more official to continue to perpetuate the idea that the government is supporting us. Well, commodity foods have had a lasting impact. And again, like I said, going from expert hunters, fishers, whalers, and farmers to being reliant on food rations that become commodity foods that look very much like this. So this era, again, there's that picture of them standing in line. Military food rations were issued regardless of culinary traditions, region, and tribe. They were cheap, inexpensive, and foreign to the biological makeup of the body chemistry of Native peoples. Military food rations would soon become known as commodity foods or commods. And non-native foods like white sugar, bleached flour, alcohol, rice, and lard have had a lasting ill effect on Native peoples that can still be seen today in the form of alcoholism, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and the many, many forms of violence. So when you think of culinary warfare, this has been one of the most wounding long-term methods that has been used against us. Create dependency and fracture and nearly wipe out the food system. So in our generation, as it relates to Indigenous resurgence, you know, when I entered food in the food world in 1998, this kind of information was very, very hard to come by. And it is still very kind of hard to come by now. But I've been able to be fortunate to see and witness forward-thinking, food-conscious organizations emerge. And this is the one that we referenced in the beginning, the one that I started when I was 18, 19 years old, the Native American Culinary Association. But now, 24 years later, there's many, many, many other Indigenous food-related organizations, companies. Food sovereignty is being woven into a lot of different curricula, but we need more. So in this Indigenous resurgence, if you can think of this presentation as like an upside down bell curve, I make reference to the Jelinek curve of recovery. Now we're going down, we went down into the depths of trauma and violence and near-death experiences, and now we're witnessing this return, this Indigenous resurgence or recovery. And in this era of Indigenous resurgence, a return to Indigenous agriculture is a really big part of this movement forward, because so much of our lives and health and practices are connected to land, that this phenomenon of land back begins to become more common. So Native food movement, there's as a chef, I didn't know that this would become a part of my life, right? I just wanted to study cooking. But as the food began to speak and it really began to demonstrate the depth of recovery and the depth of health and the depth of power and sophistication, it began to grow, and it's contagious and it's amazing. And it's a very much is a phenomenon in its own. I call it a movement, and sometimes I don't call it a movement. I look at it as a cultural occurrence, because from an anthropological perspective, again, going back to that dual consciousness or that dual perspective, me as a Native chef, I'm kind of like an anomaly. You know what I mean? Like, this might have never happened for the White Mountain Apache group ever, to have a Native chef go and do some of the things I've done. So I have to, that forces me to activate a set of ethics in my work, that what I do or what I say or what I teach has the potential to make it into history books from an anthropological perspective. It's a cultural occurrence, and it's happening in different areas of Native America. So sometimes I say it's a movement, sometimes I say it's a phenomenon, but in all reality, I feel like it's a really profound cultural occurrence that we're a part of. So other Native chefs emerge, and it begins to grow, and we do different things. This era involves us to become teachers. Here's a picture of me teaching young kids how to make pasta on the Navajo Nation. And we chose to teach pasta because I wanted to illustrate and talk about how the tomato, a native food, revolutionized Italian cooking forever. And that tomato sauce, marinara, and all the different tomato-based dishes of the Mediterranean, and especially Italy, are not, in fact, Italian, they're indigenous. And they loved it. They got a chuckle out of it, and we got to eat some noodles and tomato sauce. So this is about resurgence and recovery through native foods on a really broad perspective. Themes like organizational development. Here I make the metaphor of saying mise en place, like things in place, like cook's mind. Very much concerned in activating public health and community wellness through food and food gathering. We're fortunate that food is very tactile and experiential, and the realms of spirituality and history and nutrition that are encompassed. It's an amazing way to teach and, you know, promote education and training, which is what we do now in on the res where I work and what I do. It's a very profound method of cultural preservation. As we're through the course of this presentation and my introduction, you can see there's a ton of large words and jargon and political, scientific, nutritional, all of that. But the foods are so powerful that when we preserve them, when we grow corn or we cook some of these foods or we eat them, it pushes aside all that jargon and makes indigeneity accessible and allows the person to have the experience. And remember, our own experience is our best teacher. So that's how I feel native foods is a very powerful form of cultural preservation. This picture I wanted to add in because this is food and cooking in Taos Pueblo with some friends of mine years ago. And Taos, out in New Mexico, they're famous for their Acoma bread and the flour-based breads that are cooked in hornos or adobe ovens. And across Native America, you see fry bread and flour-based breads and whatnot. Those foods, and from my perspective, I encourage people to utilize and understand their history and consume responsibly. They have become a part of our culinary history, but they represent different things. So in this way, I feel including them into our stories and our histories is okay. Fry bread and commodity foods have contributed to health disparities, but they're a part of our legacy. And if anyone is a staunch anti-fry bread, anti, non-native foods, they might be a little bit detached from what's going on at home, where a lot of us still now today that's all we have to share and eat at home. So meeting people where they're at as it comes to traditional Native American food is very important. Allowing people to make their own decisions and embark in this journey through Foodways, because our posterity is at stake. It's very much thinking not just about me and my family right now, it's thinking about our intergenerational, because if the wounding was intergenerational, the healing is going to be intergenerational. And I hope that this presentation has caused a cross-cultural paradigm shift. Here in this picture, my young nephew is pulling the blindfold off his eyes. And I hope that continues for more Apache youth and indigenous peoples across the Americas, but also for non-native peoples, that you can encounter a presentation like this and question the reality that you've been taught, question the histories we've accepted, and really, really take a stark look at how can we move forward and coexist intelligently, promote indigenous healing, begin to intervene and stop and create interventions for colonial violence, to allow intelligent decolonization to resume, to allow ancestral knowledge to be activated, to allow indigenous resurgence to continue, all through something as beautiful as, indigenous food sovereignty. So there's so many different realms and elements to this that we could continue to go on, but in a sense, it's really about community. It's about the place where we grew up and who we are and what forged us as young adults into the professionals and adults we might be today. That by following our passions and our humanity, we unravel lessons that are timeless. And it's something that is really, truly, in my opinion, evidence that this life is a spiritual experience. And that we're not so much transforming the foods, right? That the foods are transforming us. And so this presentation is really about promoting the evolution of the evolution and preservation of Native American cuisine and health and foodways in the Americas. And here's that hashtag that you'll see, hashtag land back. And so that concludes, that's like part 1. That's like Native Foods 101 there. And as you can see, it's a really expanding heart. It opens and it breathes and it lives and it thrives. There's so much to learn from one another. And I always say that foods tell the truth. Each food has a voice. Different cultivars have different stories, different relationships, and they don't lie. It's the human narrative that tells a skewed history. And when we follow our friends, our cousins, the foods, and we investigate landscapes for ourselves, the scientific histories don't lie to us. And that's one of the coolest things that this taught me. So I'm happy to share, and thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Nephi. Thank you so much for this really, really inspiring talk. I never think of the 3 sisters in the same way. And also, as an Italian, I want to thank you for giving us the tomato plant.
Yeah, thank you so much. How fabulous. Really wonderful. Can't thank you enough.
As we wait for the questions to come in, and I trust Angela Lynn to keep an eye on that, I would like to ask you a question about languages, because I was really touched by what you said in the beginning, about not being able to express your feelings and your reflections upon trauma, historical trauma, in your own language, let's say in your indigenous language. And I was wondering if part of the restorative process also involves teaching the language. Is that an effort that is underway? What happens in that realm?
Yeah, language is a very, very critical part. It is very core to a lot of the resurgence work. And we're lucky that with for example, I mentioned I couldn't speak my language fluently, right? Well, I can't speak it fluently, but through some of the food and the practices, the foods have taught me who they are. You know what I mean? Like how to say their names in Apache, basic commands, and they kind of wake up different doorways. Different tribes in different parts of the United States, they have worked in different language programs. But it's one of those things that is going to continue to be at risk for a few more generations if we don't act now, right? Like the food sovereignty piece, we could take all of those principles of indigenous food sovereignty we talked about and say indigenous language sovereignty, right? Kind of we could take the stance to say that as Native peoples, we're forced to know more about European culture than European culture is forced to learn about us, right? So like we speak the language fluently, yet no one knows anything about Native languages. So the language pieces are really, really important.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you so much, Simonetta. Angela Lynn, do you have questions compiled there, or could I squeeze one in?
Go ahead, George. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question while we wait for more to roll in? There are a few already, though.
Yeah, I could go on for days. I'm sure you could go on for weeks. Nephi, again, I can't thank you enough. Ever indebted. I see at the top of your list of principles, you have put humility first. And in fact, I think your own life and presence in the world is imbued with that principle. I wonder if you could talk about that in terms of how it pertains to your larger project, working with your tribe's people, but also in outreach toward the traumatizers, the invasive culture that my face represents, no doubt to you.
Well, I think kind of what I've come to learn over time, and this definitely is related to my journey towards sobriety, is that a lot of times this type of information was presented to me, right? But I wasn't ready for it. I had to be ready to live out decolonization, not just entertain it from like a rebellious activist kind of standpoint. It kind of had to be kind of spiritually ready and emotionally ready. And what that taught me, and how the reason I put it in my favorite list, my list of favorite principles, is that being able to kind of follow that cultural intuition and really work to meet people where they're at and allow them to make their decisions, present people with information, present it in a way that's not too antagonistic, right? That's not too, you know, too X, Y, and Z, but that allows people to see and kind of connect the dots, form their own constellations, and make their own decision.
Yeah.
So I feel like humility is really important, and to us, that's where the power really is, you know.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. Well said. Yeah. Go right ahead there, Angelina.
All right, wonderful. Our first question comes from Alan Olson or Techo, and he says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. He says he is an IDSVA student, and he is also a Swiss trained hotelier and trained in French cuisine himself. He grew up in Central and South America, where Indigenous food and recipes are a part of their everyday diet. His question is regarding the food from Peru and Mexico. Says that they're considered the two most extensive kitchens in the world. He wants to know your thoughts on how these foods are marketed under nationalist themes or under terms such as fusion or multicultural, when they are at their very foundation Indigenous recipes and foods. What would it mean to have foods and restaurants being acknowledged, named, and attributed to civilizations and tribes such as the Mochi, Olmec, Maya, and others? Forgive me if I mispronounced any of those. There's a postscript here with his email saying that he thinks he would like to have a conversation with you in the future regarding his dissertation topic. So I could send you his email.
Yeah, I'd be open to that. I think I always say that, you know, American cuisine or contemporary cuisine is built on Indigenous cuisine, right? I always say that when we're in this journey, it's almost like the dust is settled a little bit more. Like I mentioned in the beginning, more Native peoples have entered different professions, and we're able to advocate more. We're able to assert ourselves and reclaim and work for justice more. And I feel like we've been living in generations of cultural appropriation, you know, for quite some time. And so each of us as practitioners, whether we're cooks, chefs, community members, whatever we might be in our lives, we have the opportunity to assert and challenge the narratives, and to, you know, disengage from cultural appropriation. There's like cultural appropriation is like it seems like there's kind of two ways to look at it. There's cultural appreciation, where you could cook some of these recipes at home and you could celebrate the foods, and, you know, you're learning about it in that way. Where cultural appropriation is where, say, like, you're a non-native and you set up a Native American food restaurant and you build an empire, and, you know, you X, Y, and Z, and you're profiting from indigenous ancestral knowledge. So I feel like there's that distinction right there, and I feel like it's going to continue. It's up to people like us that recognize and see and believe and know it's true, to be able to talk about it, to begin to change that pattern of appropriation. I have a whole hit list of chefs that have done this, you know what I mean, that built empires on indigenous foodways, you know what I mean? And they're out there. And what's going to cause them to listen? You know, what are they willing to give up for the truth, right? So it's a long journey. But I think it's up to people like us to continue to have the conversations and talk and be intelligent about how we go about it. So I think it can change. I think we'll see.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question comes from one of our instructors at IDSVA, Dahan Lukic, and he says, first, thank you for such an incredible and clear, plentiful presentation. His question is about storytelling and historical trauma. You mentioned Foodways as a form of storytelling. Do we need to also write new myths, new origin stories, or to help reorient the futures? Thank you again very much. Dahan from New Mexico.
I really appreciate that. Storytelling is such a valuable tool, not just for Indigenous and Native American peoples. Storytelling is how we keep traditions alive. Think of every recipe that we cherish and love in our own lives. we're cooking from memory, right? We're cooking from a past that's gone. And so when we're able to utilize food as storytelling, it's edible education. And it can even be a way to process grief. My father passed away years ago, and he used to make this dish with ground beef, a can of mushroom soup, those green spinach noodles. He'd brown them all up and put them together, and he'd say, "All right, boys, come and eat some camouflage goulash," you know. And my dad was a Marine Corps dude and all that. And for a long time after he passed, I couldn't really talk about that dish or even cook it. And so, as from processing some of the grief to help heal from the loss of my father, now I'm able to talk about that dish and share it. I can cook it at home and make my kids laugh, and it's a way to remember who we are and where we come from. So it is a very valuable tool when we combine storytelling. And I do think when we create origin stories, like each and every one of us have our own origin stories, right? Our own creation stories as individuals, where we come from different cultures with different epistemologies, but we all have our own story of how we were reborn again into a life of second sight, or how we were born into the next phase of our life. And those are origin stories as well. So I'm saying think, individually, but also culturally too. So I think it's a really great question we could talk about more, but thanks.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Britain. She again thanks you so much for a beautiful eye-opening talk. She was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the process of Indigenous cooking itself. She says that you speak about the foods and farming, but what are their techniques or rituals or ways of thinking and being in the kitchen that you are bringing awareness to as well?
Well, I think there's, just like in all cultures, cooking is very vast, right? Cooking is always going to be a mix of societies, histories, and cultures, right? And when it comes to native or indigenous cooking, it's going to change place by place. Some of us cooks will cherish and choose cooking on an open fire. Other of us will just be cooking at home, or other of us will be cooking in restaurants. So there's really no like one style. It's very dynamic and very diverse. And I think we're going to see how the next 10, 20, 25 years into the future what native cooking is going to look like, because it can be like on the professional level like we do in the kitchens. But I think what's most important about Indigenous Foodways is that it's not about restaurant culture. Even though, like for us, we operate as a vocational site in the restaurant setting, but I think food is more valuable when it's taught and shared and cooked at home, when we can share this food history in the place where it matters to us the most. And that's real revolution, in my opinion, when we're able to impact our children's lives by what we feed them, and impact our own lives by what we feed ourselves. So Indigenous cooking is going to continue to grow and change. Some practitioners are very radical to where they're using all clay pots and open fire cooking. Some of us are more contemporary, where we do the practices with what we have now. It just depends on where you go and what region of the states, and their access to resources too. So I hope that answers part of the question.
Wonderful, thank you. So there was a question posted by Stanley. I'm going to go and take the liberty and reformulate it a little bit. Basically, what he was asking was how your Native American restaurant that you opened is actually changing the concept of restaurants, seeing that it is spreading ancestral knowledge for Indigenous Resurgence and ingenuity.
I think the next phase that I feel we've encountered is the spiritual, intellectual component. You see, for us in the cafe that we have now, we were very fortunate as White Mountain Apaches to be able to pull off what we did. Ancestrally and throughout history, I intimately believe that our people always had a keen foresight as Apache people. We're able to kind of sense and see things coming. And in a sense, for us, we had as a community a lot of components that other tribes don't have, for example. Many tribes were dislocated and displaced and removed and put in different areas on those reservations, right? And they don't have access to land. For us on the White Mountain Apache Tribe, we were never displaced. We're still in our ancestral landscape. We have access to land. We have fluent language speakers. We have the resources to create this cafe. And even though we were able to do what most people are just beginning to talk about in Indian country, we execute it, we pull it off, we create the structure and the programming, we got the support. And then the next battle is the psychological, emotional, behavioral side of colonization, because we can combine all of these elements and present decolonization or indigenous resurgence through Foodways and present food facts, yet we're still dealing with the internalized oppression or the internalized colonization of community members. So the paradigm that fresh, colorful food is not native, that's for white people, is prevalent, can be prevalent. That even though we're cooking with corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, lettuces that are grown at a farm nearby, with tomatoes, it's colorful. Unfortunately, most marginalized communities in America and maybe even abroad associate fresh, colorful, healthy, plant-based with whiteness, right? That's kind of the association it makes. And that says privilege and power, right? So for us, we grew up with some of those commodity food dishes I presented those ingredients. So that's how we're kind of internalized the oppression. We've been forced and beat down to accept commodity food-based traditional dishes, to the fact that we won't question it, because ancestrally the consequences of challenging what was given to us by foods, or in terms of foods, could be very dangerous. They could withhold foods and we're not able to go hunting. So I feel like it's really important to be able to continue this work. I hope that answered some of the question there. I feel like it's a really long process, but I think, like, for us, it's that next phase. Like I said, we're very fortunate to create and pull it off, but then the educational piece and spreading the information and allowing people to accept and do it. So change is a gradual thing, and it's very challenging. It's very challenging, and that's kind of right where we're at, is right on that phase of the October 26th is going to be our 1-year anniversary of opening the cafe you're referring to. And so we're just at the beginning, and we're excited about the future. So we'll see.
Thank you for answering that question and then some. Our final question comes from Shane Agar. So she says she is honored to hear this presentation today, and she wonders if you credit the ability to move away from the toxic culture of the mainstream high-pressure restaurant kitchens with the matrilineal mode of leadership or foodways from your culture.
Definitely, I think it's a combination. It's a combination. Definitely wanting to. Like for me, my upbringing, right, as a chef, I worked in European kitchens. I trained under non-native chefs, and this culture of ego and violence and racism and oppression and classes with cuisine, right? That's kind of how I grew up, right? And so as I'm working to understand native foodways, most of the people that I had to turn to understand for myself were mothers, were aunties, were matriarchs in our communities. And trusting me with their information, their stories, is something that I really hold dear. And so that kind of taught me as a son and a dad that I had to be kind of respectful with my approach to food and cooking. And not only did I not like pretending that being in a high-end kitchen wasn't impacting my identity, it wasn't chipping it away at enduring the microaggressions or enduring the direct racist comments or whatever, to deny that was not impacting me, it was just hurting me more. So trying to find a more intelligent way forward, yet still being able to do food and cooking at a high level. And what that kind of brought me to was the list of principles, is that We might not be cooking, 3 Michelin star style cuisine, but we're operating by similar principles of dignity, health, recovery, education, training and discipline, group conscious, those kind of things. And all those group dynamics, when they come together, there's a lot there. And so I feel like that side of us helps us to see and understand, like in a lot of the foods, and like I'll use hard squash as an example because it's autumn, right? Right now, we're going to start seeing pumpkins, butternut squash, acorn squash, delicata squash, all of these cavity squash, right? And we all consider them very nutritious and awesome and amazing. But I don't think we ever stop to say, why is it that way? What I think is that they're that way because those are all mama squash, right? They all got the little tiny seeds, all the little babies in there to continue the cycle of life, right? And in native cooking, little stories like that pop out all along the way from different cultivars. They remind us that, the continuation of life is matrilineal. Our ceremonies remind us of the same thing. And, I cannot not be inspired by that as well as a member of my community. So I think that also was really heightened with sobriety, because with sobriety, the ego gets tamed and you're open to more messages from the universe and from life in general. So it's a combination of both of those for me, I think. So I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your characterization of the mama squash also expands on the question from Dahan earlier about, new mythologies and narratives being created in this. So wonderful. I did say that the last one was last question. However, as you were answering, there was one more question that was posted.
Let's make it the last.
Yeah, we could either leave it as an open question because the question itself deserves to be said and we can all think about it in relation to the talk, or maybe you could give a short answer since we are out of time. So the question comes from Amenahu Amici, and he says, he is fascinated by the motif of the three sisters as interplanting and integrational, and that reminds him of the African indigenous seasonal planting, the 7-year phase of planting. Could you respond to the thinking about respect for land and respect for humans? How did the motif originate? Thank you, Amenahu.
I think it, the three sisters exist in different forms. Like it's more of a Midwestern tribal thing in the United States. For us in White Mountain Apache land, I never heard of three sisters as I was growing up. But the reason I use it to teach it is because all my life I saw corn, beans, and squash on the table all the time in different combinations. But no one ever called it three sisters. But I think the way those stories evolve and grow is just through that, human observation and watching and interaction. And I think that's one of the ways that it's happened. And that's one of the best ways that it teaches, I think. So I hope that answers the question. I know we're out of time, but human observation, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nephi.
Nephi, I can't thank you enough. And I can't wait to hear you speak more. You bring to us great blessings, and for that, we're ever indebted. But maybe if we live some of the lessons you taught us today, we can begin to pay you back that way. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Nephi. Again, wonderful insights, and thanks to everybody who is here today, and thank you for your questions and contributions. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah, and
thank you. Thank you for having me, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Nephi. Thank you, Angela Lynn.
Thank you, Angela Lynn. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye. Bye, George. Bye, everybody.